Welcome back to The Place of Places, a chapter-by-chapter analysis of William Saroyan's 1972 memoir, Places Where I've Done Time. Today, we set sail on the Berengaria, New York to Southampton, 1935. It's springtime, 1935, and Saroyan is famous on the heels of 1934's The Daring Young Man on the Flying Trapeze and other stories. He's finally got a little money in his pocket, and he's ready to explore the world to meet humanity on the big stage. He was also churning out stories, releasing Inhale and Exhale and 3x3 in 1936. This is a brief chapter in which he explains that he was on this massive ocean liner, riding third class but feeling rich just to be on the behemoth. He can't sleep, so he goes to the great room looking for a bite to eat in the middle of the night. A middle-aged British worker appears and provides him with a tray full of ham and cheese sandwiches. And then, like a fairy godmother, returns with a tray of milk, bottled water, and ginger ale. Saroyan is overwhelmed with the occasion. He tells the worker that he'd like all of the drinks, and the worker responds that's what they're there for, and he leaves. This simple admission that there is enough to go around troubles Saroyan, who knows that many of his countrymen are starving while this bounty is bestowed upon him at no extra cost. And perhaps he's thinking of his poverty-stricken childhood as well. The Berengaria was originally a German ship called the Imperator for the Hamburg-America line, and it made its first voyage between Cuxhaven, Germany, and New York in 1913. During World War I, it was kept in Hamburg harbor and in 1919 seized by the U.S. Navy as a troop transport. The Navy then handed it over to the British as reparations for the Germans sinking the Lusitania. The British assigned it to the dominating Cunard ship line for operation, where it was eventually renamed the Berengaria and ran between Southampton and New York for nearly 20 years. It had 11 decks and was briefly the largest ocean liner in the world. It employed over 1,100 crew members and held over 4,200 passengers, including 962 in third class, where Saroyan found himself. In 1938, it caught fire in New York and was sold for scrap later that year. The name itself came from Berengaria of Navarre, the wife of Richard the Lionheart, King of England in the 1100s. Although in Sons Come and Go, Mothers Hang In Forever, Saroyan's journey was on the Aquitania, another huge Cunard line ship of epic proportions. These ships would have been similar, but it's interesting that Saroyan gives differing data. Perhaps he just preferred the way one ship's name sounded. Either way, he definitely took a ship to Europe in 1935. Transatlantic travel had been a way for wealthy Americans to travel to Europe, and newspapers often made note of particularly high-class passenger lists. At the same time, the lower decks of these ships were moving immigrants from Europe to America. The prestige had lost a bit of its luster. In the 1930s, though, American immigration quotas greatly slowed overseas migration. With fewer passengers, Cunard and other shipping lines attempted to appeal to the middle class, and transatlantic travel was widened again. Now newspapers were posting passenger lists as a form of marketing to the aspiring classes. In spring of 1935, it made a great deal about famous passengers sailing on the Berengaria to attend King George's Silver Jubilee in London. Saroyan wasn't quite wealthy yet, but his writing allowed him to make middle-class travel decisions, like making his way across Europe, staying in hotels, and eating well. In spring of 1935, Saroyan had never left the U.S., and this trip would take him to London, France, Central Europe, Finland, Soviet Armenia, and Moscow. Though he looked forward to visiting Red Russia, he found it disappointing there, with communism not at all aligning with his ideals. He came home from that trip more worldly and more jaded. He would travel to Europe many more times in his life, and of course bought a flat at Rue Taitbout in Paris eventually. His first stop was London, where he did a bit of gambling and met with Geoffrey Faber, the UK publisher of The Daring Young Man on the Flying Trapeze. Then on to Paris, where he visited the Hotel Scribe for the first time, and the Galignani Library, an English-language bookstore Saroyan loved, and which is still open today. Then to Finland, where he met Jean Sibelius, composer of Finlandia, a piece Saroyan had been obsessed with for 10 years, and which inspired his short story Finlandia, which he wrote right there in 1935. Eventually, he made his way south to Soviet Armenia, trying to get as close to Bitlis as he could without a Turkish visa. There he met with poor Armenians within a so-called equal society. This was eye-opening for Saroyan and continued to inform his writing. Many of his stories from this trip focus on meeting Yegish Charants, born Sogomonian. Charants was a great Armenian poet, activist, and early supporter of Bolshevism, then living in Moscow. Stalinist Russia disillusioned him, however, and he was arrested in the Great Purge of 1937 and died shortly thereafter. Saroyan deeply admired Charants and saw him as representing the soul of Armenia. Charants appears in others of Saroyan's memoirs, including Letters from 74 Rue Tabu, and this meeting in Moscow was incredibly powerful to young Saroyan, still searching for his identity. But the rest of his Moscow trip was saddening to him. In obituaries, he wrote, "And I have never had any use at all for any kind of foreign government or system, and was especially amused when all of the supposedly or theoretically good and important writers of America got themselves into a lather, believing that by God at last the world was going to be decent to everybody, and that the whole human race was going to be given a chance to breathe freely at last, and enjoy the fruits of wealth, by means of Marxist, Leninist, Stalinist, Russianist, bullshitist social revolution. God, what jolly and mean bastards all those superior punks, male and female, were. What poisons they released inside themselves and through the pores of their bodies upon such fools as all who did not join them. And I did not, could not, would not, both because they were full of shit and because they were all sentimental slobs and all around assholes. But for a while, during my earliest years as a published writer, I actually believed that something, by God, something, could and would make for a more equitable balance among all of the peoples of the world, or in any country, or on any continent. I believed that because I wanted that balance to happen. But after I visited Russia during the first half of 1935 and saw the truth and the light, and came back to America, I knew I had better put my thinking and longing and believing on another track, moving in another direction, and likely to reach either something like the same happy destination, or likely to reach the kind of awareness that would make the imbalance at least a little less painful and wrong than it always has been. Places Where I've Done Time specifically addresses this trip to Moscow in another chapter, so we will wait for that one to delve even deeper. He ends our chapter, "I just sat and ate and drank and thought, and I think that half hour was one of the happiest, somberest, most melancholy, most loving of my life. I loved everybody and everything and felt sorry for the lot." Saroyan is addressing class. He's writing third class even though he is newly moneyed. He's showered with food and drink and alone, and realizes that he can philosophize on the foibles of humanity because his basic needs are being more than met, which wasn't always the case in his life. In his life, he never liked being around the wealthy and seemed to actively lose any money he made through gambling. It was a way of keeping himself humble in a strange way. The Berengaria symbolized the economic inequities that troubled Saroyan as he came into money but didn't know how to be upper class. This is a subject he talked about his entire life. Some armchair psychologists might suggest that there is survivor's guilt in succeeding when one's family or community is left behind, in this case financially. Later, most of Saroyan's generation of cousins either entered the robust middle class of the 1950s, or even better, struck it rich in the entertainment business, in mining, in many different fields. But in 1935, The post-war economic boom was nowhere in sight, and the idea of excess seemed both appealing and disgusting to young William. This chapter is a tight snapshot of the internal battle Saroyan would face for decades as he dealt with the shame of poverty and the opposite shame of decadent wealth. Let's put this on the Saroyan map and move on.